Hey, oi. Tell them about esports pools.
But why would I do that?
Skrilla, right? Yes, I do enjoy money and the freedoms it provides the illusion of. Tell them it's not just fantasy esports where you compose a team, it's also got betting.
For LCS and other leagues?
Just do it, alright?
Okay, bossy.
Right, take off your glasses so we can assume your public persona.
What do you mean? We. What's the deal with this guy?
Riot Games earlier this year announced their plans to franchise the NA LCS, the flagship league of their game, League of Legends. So for the spring split of 2018, for Season 8 of League of Legends, the franchise system, or I believe it was called the Permanent Partnership Program or system or something, would be implemented. And as a result, over the latter half of 2017, teams were able to take part in an application process to potentially secure a franchise slot for Season 8 for 2018. And the cost for teams who already had an NALCS spot was $10 million laid out over 3 years and with a full revenue sharing plan already disclosed to these owners. If an owner came along who didn't have an NALCS spot or had been relegated, same thing basically, then they had to pay $13 million, with the extra $3 million going into a fund to compensate the owners who ended up not being, who had NALCS slots, but ended up not being accepted into the partnership program and therefore effectively replaced or forced to sell. Now, among the teams accepted, yes, there were a lot of names that made a lot of sense. Classic teams from the LCS, teams like TSM, the most storied, successful team. Cloud9, one of the best teams, especially in terms of results and organizational management for the majority of the LCS. Team Liquid, fantastically run organization with a lot of history. CLG, up and down, but champions at certain points in time, and have definitely developed from a big team to a smaller team to somewhere in the middle now, and perhaps on the rise again with investment. And obviously, you had some of the newer slots taken by teams from outside, big sports franchises, people who haven't currently been owners in NLCS. But the big shock initially was some of the people who didn't make it in. So, for example, Immortals, one of the best teams in NALCS right now, and one of the best organizations in the NALCS, were not included. The implication being that something about their business model, which was shared with Riot as part of this process, disturbed them, or whoever was on this panel making the decision. And the implication was they didn't think the business plan was sound, or that it made sense to partner with someone like this for years going forwards, either in the context of perhaps they wouldn't be able to have additional funding in the future, or they thought that the business model was too risky perhaps with how they'd spread it out over the Overwatch League as well, even though obviously there are other teams who are in the like Cloud9 who are in this partnership program and the Overwatch League. Admittedly, they have to call themselves London Spitfire, they're not Cloud9. So the context there was quite shocking for outsiders because we don't know exactly what the details were and how these decisions were made. But I actually think more shocking should be the context of the ownership conflicts which have now been discovered and exposed within the NALCS and which will continue to exist for around 11 to 12 months from now while these teams compete against each other. Because in an article published by Ben Fisher, a staff writer for Sports Business Daily, the article was titled "Riot Games Goes Big into Stick and Ball Sports to Fill Out NALCS Franchise Roster." And within this, he explains some of the different sports franchises that are getting involved. And towards the end, he has a section called Settling Conflicts of Interest, in which he explains that of the 10 teams in the league, they are collectively owned by dozens of different sports investors through one vehicle or another. There are at least 3 cross-ownership issues to be resolved. Riot prohibits any individual from owning stakes in multiple League of Legends teams, and he then starts to lay out some of the people involved, but he doesn't give all the context for people who don't know the sports teams. So essentially, one of the new NALCS teams with a slot is the Golden Guardians, and they are a new franchise spot owned by the company behind the Golden State Warriors NBA franchise, who obviously are currently the reigning NBA champions. So someone involved with that is Peter Guber, who is the co-executive chairman of the Golden State Warriors, but also also serves as the chair of Axiomatic. And Axiomatic is a company which in the past purchased a majority stake in Team Liquid, another NA LCS franchise team. Now, also within the Golden State Warriors company is Kirk Lacob, the Warriors' assistant general manager. And he is also involved in Axiomatic. He is an investor and therefore himself has a conflict of interest. So two people involved in the Warriors organization have interest in Axiomatic and therefore have an interest in Team Liquid. Now, Chamath Palihapitiya, Warriors executive board member, is an investor in Cloud9. So in this scenario, through the Golden State Warriors and the Golden Guardians, their franchise, we have three different people who are involved with conflicts of interest involving two other LCS teams, because we've got the Golden Guardians, we've got Team Liquid, and we've got Cloud9. Now, why is this significant? Were there just never rules for this in the past in the LCS? Had it never been attempted, and therefore Riot's having to figure it out on their feet? No. There have been explicit rules against ownership of multiple teams, even going beyond just ownership, for many seasons in the LCS, therefore prohibiting certain behaviors such as this exact type of conflict of interest. And you can go and see, I'll put it in the description box below, the rule set for the most recent split of the NA LCS, the summer split of Season 7, 2017. And if you go down to Section 3, which is titled Team Ownership and Roster Rules, in subsection 3.1, Team Ownership Restriction, it says, if an owner or affiliate of owner is found to have any financial interest or benefit or any level of influence in another team, he/she will be required to immediately divest said interest in one of the two teams and may be subject to punishment by the LCS. Later on, there's a section that covers another aspect of this, which says any buyback provision, right of first purchase, or similar interest in a team shall be treated as a controlling interest in such team for the purposes of enforcing ownership restrictions. So let's go over that first part where it says that any owner or affiliate of owner, and it doesn't just say financial interest or benefit or level of influence in another team. This is the key part, is that you don't even have to own a majority stake or own a controlling stake in the team. If you just own part of the team and therefore could be seen to have exerted influence perhaps behind the scenes, convincing someone to do something, not necessarily being able to order them to do it as if you owned the team or had the majority stake, that's not allowed. You're also not allowed to get any kind of benefit from another team. So you can be an entirely silent partner with no marketing rights whatsoever who doesn't even ever say anything to them, but somehow you benefit from their team while having another team at the same time. That is not allowed either. And if that happens, any of these situations, you must immediately divest said interest in one of the two teams you can pick, and you may in fact get punished if it's found that this is the case. Then the second part about the buyback provision, right of first purchase or similar interest being treated as if it was a controlling interest now. The point there is, if you have a buyback provision, that's like a clause that says, I've sold you the team because I already have a team, but you know what? I can buy it back in a year or in 2 years or for $10 million. That means that even though technically you don't own the team right now, and that's all above board for Riot, Riot treats it as if you do already own the team, and that's a context in which you do somehow exert influence so that you don't have people just selling the team to their cousin and then technically still running the whole team and then telling them once, if it ever gets really big, I'm just going to buy it back in 2 years. To avoid all of that, they have this in place. I think it's a good rule. Likewise, right of first purchase. So if you ever are going to sell the team, person I sold the team to, I get first dibs. I can match any offer and buy the team back. Again, that's not allowed to avoid these conflicts of interest. And finally, to have a similar interest in a team. These are all treated as if right now you have the ownership of both teams and therefore it is not allowed. It is prohibited behavior. But whereas in the past, you had to immediately divest as soon as Riot were aware that you had this conflict of interest or any level of ownership stake or even just influence or benefit from the teams, you had to immediately divest and were actually potentially subject to punishment. In this case, they have given the parties involved 12 months, a year, essentially a year, to resolve the conflicts of interest through either divestment, which means selling off your share, or creation of a separate entity with a separate cap table of investment investment who then will take over the ownership. Now, the reason why it's significant is there are actually many instances in the history of League of Legends where this has prohibited certain behaviors that would have benefited some of these teams because they couldn't violate these rules, whereas these new owners are being allowed to actively violate and explicitly violate these rules for a 12-month period. So when the LCS first launched in 2013, Season 3, was when we first had the NA and EU LCS. And at the time in the NA LCS, the big four were the organizations TSM, Team Solo Mid, CLG, Counter Logic Gaming, Dignitas, Team Dignitas, and Curse. Now, these squads, at the time, at the very least, were considering and would have, if allowed to, have gotten multiple LCS teams. So you might have had, as you did in the Season 2 circuit, 2 teams for some of these orgs. So you had TSM, you had TSM Evo, you had CLG Prime, you had CLG Black. These were kind of like challenger teams and farm teams, yes, but they competed in the exact same tournaments as TSM did back then and as CLG did back then. And it was just the fact that the LCS came along that they no longer had these teams. Remember, there wasn't challenger initially. Well, there was, but it was a different circuit. It wasn't a league in the same way as it is now. So not only could these teams not do it, but some of them almost certainly would have, because guess what? With their financial backing at that time, the top teams, these big four, had way more money and sponsorship backing than the other squads did. So they would have gotten these other teams to, first of all, have 2 chances at winning LCS, to have 2 chances at staying in LCS, to have players that they could then transfer from one team to another to upgrade their bigger roster, have a farm team, or to take a different direction. So you have a very good player on your main team and he's not working out, right? We go and put him on the other team so we don't lose the value of the investment or the trade deal that we did as his value goes down, perhaps from playing on our main team. Then you've got the factor that obviously they could have then brought in more sponsorship dollars by having 2 teams in the league. So it actually would have been a benefit in many senses, but it would have provided these conflicts of interest that Riot wants to avoid, and I agree with should avoid. Likewise, not just in the same league like NALCS, these teams could have had a European franchise team. Well, it wasn't a franchise at the time, but a European LCS team as well as an NALCS team. We already know in Season 2, 2 of these big teams did. CLG had CLG EU. So in CLG NA, they had the CLG Prime team, which was Hotshot and Chowster and Doublelift. And that was one of the best teams, yes. But they had a better team in Europe. They had CLG Europe, CLG EU, which was Snoopy and Wicked and Froggen, the team that went to top 4 at the World Championship, the team that won DreamHack Summer, the team that was in the final and 1 game from winning OGN's Summer 2012 over in Korea. Likewise, Curse EU had a team, the one that was playing with Extinct as their mid laner, and that made it and beat Moscow 5 at Tales of the Lane and won the tournament in Season 2. These squads, these organizations might have kept their European teams or gotten different European teams for the EU LCS, spreading out their sponsorship again, having penetration into different markets. But again, there might have been a conflict of interest. Obviously, these teams could have played at a world championship. These teams, in theory, could have done all sorts of other things that people might not have wanted. Like, for example, you could see match-fixing possibilities here if you had teams in different leagues. Like, for example, if I know over in Europe that if my European team, who isn't doing very well, throws a game to a rival of, let's say, Fnatic, that means that now Fnatic doesn't get the top seed, and maybe in some setting, Fnatic now doesn't make the playoffs and therefore aren't then a threat to come to Worlds and beat my squad, perhaps CLG or TSM or whoever it might be, at Worlds. You can see how you never want even the possibility of these conflicts of interest to turn into something more immediate, and therefore just when you identify there's a conflict of interest, you get rid of it. You prohibit this behavior. Evil Geniuses had a team in Europe in Season 3. It was CLG EU. When CLG EU was sold from CLG, it became Evil Geniuses. Well, it wasn't sold. The players just didn't re-up their contracts and they signed with Evil Geniuses. So in Europe, we had an Evil Geniuses team. But in Season 4, we had Evil Geniuses in the NALCS. Now, how was that possible? Because technically, Evil Geniuses did not own the North American LCS team that bore their name. What happened was they owned a team called Alliance over in Europe, who obviously with Froggen and Wicked won the Season 4 Summer Split and placed, I think it was 4th place in the Spring Split. Now, why they had a team called Evil Geniuses is because they found a workaround to trying to own 2 teams while not owning 2 teams by the Riot rules by taking a team called Velocity and having their owner remain the owner of the team, but striking a sponsorship deal with Velocity, which, by the way, you're already getting some very vague terminology here. So they were somehow taking over the marketing or sponsorship of Velocity, but remember, Evil Geniuses themselves, like most teams back then, was essentially operated like an agency. They took players' media and marketing rights and sold them off to sponsors for certain deals and promised certain hours, and essentially just handled the marketing and media rights. Therefore, by handling it for Velocity, yes, you don't own the team. You can't do some of the things if you own the team, but you all but own the team in terms of how you're operating it. And therefore, Evil Geniuses, in some context, had two teams, one in NA LCS, one in ELCS. They just didn't in the overall sense, and they managed to get around the Riot rules in this particular sense. And apparently Riot were very diligent in checking that they weren't doing something behind the scenes, or so it's been claimed. Then you have the scenario where teams like Cloud9, Fnatic, Misfits had teams in LCS, and then they had challenger teams. And because their challenger teams were so successful, their challenger teams qualified from Challenger Division, which is the league below the LCS, to play in the LCS the next split. And because they had qualified, and therefore Cloud9, Fnatic, and Misfits now essentially owned two LCS slots, these teams were forced to divest themselves, to pick one of the two teams to continue to own and to sell off their ownership stake in the other team. And therefore, in all these instances, they took their challenger team and sold them to other people, and therefore couldn't have two NA LCS teams or two EU LCS teams. Now, these teams weren't allowed to violate this rule and then get a 12-month cooling off period and play two splits in the LCS and actually increase the value of their players and perhaps even swap players between the teams before they sell off the team to make one of the teams juicier, or to say, actually, I'm going to sell the slot, but I'm going to put all the best players onto this other team after testing out the two rosters. They didn't have any conflict of interest. They immediately sold off the teams. Yet, in this particular case, where teams are going to be directly competing against each other for two splits, that is not the case. It's being treated differently. Then we had the scenario with Jens Hilgers. Jens Hilgers was someone who had an ownership stake in G2 and was involved somehow in the founding of G2, as far as I know. Richard had a whole video on this topic, and I had my own video on this particular case, which was where Jens Hilgers gave a loan to Fnatic. And within the context of the loan was a clause that said if Fnatic defaulted on the loan, could not pay back the loan, then Jens Hilgers owned Fnatic, or at least some stake of Fnatic. Now, Riot claimed that they were going to make Jens Hilgers reverse the loan, whatever that terminology means to this day. I think it's purposely disingenuous terminology, as I outlined in that video on the topic. And the reason he had to reverse the loan immediately is because they treated it as though, even though Fnatic hadn't defaulted on the loan, and to my knowledge have not defaulted on the loan, because he had this clause which meant that he would then own the team, it was treated as if that immediately was effective, and he now did own two teams, G2 and Fnatic. Now, the most egregious example of Riot applying these rules was one where there wasn't even any actual evidence, as far as we know, to prove that it was the case, which was the Renegades team. Because Renegades had their owner, Monte Cristo, banned from owning the team and forced to sell off the slot. He eventually sold it to Envious. Not just because of the whole unsafe environment angle that was surrounding Maria, who was a player for the team at the time, but also for the claim that Monte Cristo, then the owner of the League of Legends team, planned to give Chris Badawi, the former owner of the team, who had been banned from ownership of an LCS team, funnily enough, quick sidebar, for rules which didn't exist at the time for poaching and for players he never actually did poach, never succeeded to poach, which were applied retroactively. Little detail to note there, Riot can make up rules and then apply them however they want, and they can change the rules and your punishment depending on who you are. Not if you did the same crime like a reasonable judge would in a court scenario, taking into account your history and what you've actually done and then trying to be as fair as possible, but just depending on who you are, they can change how they decide to treat the rule and whether you get punished or whether you're allowed to have a special dispensation and get away with certain behavior that was previously prohibited. So in this setting, no evidence was ever produced to prove that Monte Cristo had a deal in place where either Chris Badawi could buy back or he had the first right of purchase if Monte Cristo ever sold, or that he had any kind of overt influence beyond being involved with Renegades outside of the LCS team. There was never any scenario in that was presented. There was just a rumor that was put out there, and therefore, off the back of that rumor, Renegades, Monte Cristo was banned and forced to sell the team. He didn't get a 12-month period to make sure that this contract was rewritten, so there wasn't a buyback clause. Remember, there was no contract, by the way, but in this hypothetical scenario, he wasn't given a period, a cooling off period to go to Badawi and say, actually, this deal, which by the way never existed, but Riot claims exists, isn't going to go forwards, and I'll even get it in writing from you and present it to Riot with my own writing, which is my own statement, which is going to be notarized, saying that I will not allow you to own the team again. None of this was allowed. He wasn't allowed to reverse the loan on the topic or have someone divest interest. Remember, they didn't have interest and actually had no actual paper trail to show that they had evidence. But they weren't allowed to do any of these things that the current owners are allowed to do because why? Well, presumably because it was Chris Badawi and not one of these owners. It wasn't treated based on the crime. It was based on who you were. So that is the definition of unfair treatment. Now, in the article that was written by, what was his name? Ben Fisher, it was also written up and reported on by ESPN. And on ESPN, they had a statement that said, this was by the Lakeb, it said, Peter approached me and said, look, I'm investing in Team Liquid with this new thing, Axiomatic, and I'd love to have you join. I said, sure, and I saw that as an opportunity to get a foot in the door, Lakeb told ESPN. I will obviously be removing myself from Axiomatic and Team Liquid. I'm obviously not an important piece of what they're doing, but I still need to remove myself to make sure things are on the up and up. Now, first and foremost, if you're wondering what will happen with this, as they said with being able to create a separate entity with a separate cap table, the reason why that's logical to actually even just admit is because most of these teams anyway, people aren't going to invest millions and have influence or controlling stakes in teams and then just go, oh, what? I'm not allowed to do that, right? Well, I guess I'll just sell it for whatever it costs right now, or I'll sell it off immediately. And even though I made a massive investment, I might have to sell it for less, or I might have to sell it now when the whole point of investing was for more, and I've already done things with that org. No, what will happen most likely is they will just get a third-party entity to take over ownership. Now, yes, they won't be able to have a contract that has a buyback clause or the first opportunity to buy the team, etc. But they can just have their cousin is the guy who's in name owns the team. Someone like their wife potentially. Like, there's a lot of options here that people can understand how you can get around this and still technically own the two teams, but not in the same direct way which Riot's trying to prohibit. Now, there's not a lot Riot can really do about that, so I wouldn't blame them in this particular section. But for those wondering why it's significant that you could have any kind of ownership stake in two teams, and why is this a conflict of interest? Why is it a big deal? Think about this. When you own two teams or more in the league, you can now engage, as I highlighted before and alluded to with some of the teams, if they'd had an EU LCS or an NA LCS or two NA LCS teams, you can engage in behavior which then compromises the competitive integrity of the league. In other words, results won't be legitimate or independent of factors outside the game. They won't just be... You won't be able to look at a result and go, right, that result happened because the two teams played, one was better, one had a certain strategy or certain skills or certain plays, and that's why they won the game, and that's all I need to know. You'll always have to wonder, oh, but wait a minute, doesn't that guy have an interest or some sort of influence over the other team that just lost the game? Because the worst case scenario is obviously that there's match fixing, that teams actually fix some of the results to a particular end. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Team A is in a position where they need one specific win to make the playoffs. Meanwhile, Team B, who also is owned or has a stake or an influence from one of the owners of Team A, already is in the playoffs, so they don't need to win their game necessarily. Or they can't make the playoffs, and they don't need to win their game necessarily. And therefore, they lose the game to Team A, who needs the win, and Team A makes the playoffs as a result. Now, I could already say right there, ooh, what was going on there, right? Isn't that a conflict of interest? That shouldn't be allowed. Even worse, if there's actual match fixing going on, then that is literally absolutely a violation of the rules and is not allowed in any context and shouldn't even be possible. Then you've got to consider that, at least in the past, in LCS, in NA LCS, you had at least relegation. So actually teams at the bottom still had something to play for. They wanted to stay in the LCS. So you could have actually, by the way, had throwing the other way as well. The team that's already made the playoffs throws a game so that someone avoided relegation. Well, what's funny is, in the new LCS, there isn't relegation. So actually now, any team that knows it can't make the playoffs and is near the bottom, if someone owns another team that can, you already have to think, oh my God, I hope there's no match fixing going on here. And you have to worry about that. There's a real concern you must be worried about, because people have an incentive to take part in such behavior which breaks the rules. Then you've got to consider, since they've got a 12-month cooling off period, they have two whole splits in which to operate these three different teams. So let's say that one of their teams does very well, and then they decide, right, well, I want the other team also to have a chance at making Worlds. So what I'll do is, on the team that did very well, one of our positions is still weak. Let's say the jungler. Meanwhile, one of the players who is, well, let's do that the other way around. Let's say that one of the teams does well, and they want, and the other team did so poorly that it's almost certain they won't make Worlds. Now, in this setting, let's say that a player for the team that did well isn't that good a player on the team. They did well in spite of him. For example, like Longju over in LCK, won LCK and made it to the playoffs of Worlds with Cuz, who wasn't even vaguely a top jungler in Korea and could absolutely have been upgraded and probably made them a better team, as indeed has happened since then. At least the upgrade element. Now, in this setting, what if you then take the team that hasn't done well and you say, right, well, they're not going to make Worlds anyway, so let's stack up the other team and have a really solid run at Worlds and try and get this team there. So we're going to take the star jungler of the lesser team, a Dardoch, whatever, a Lyra type scenario, and we're going to put him onto the better team, replacing a Svenskeren or a Mike Young or someone like that, and we're going to upgrade that team and make them even better. And we're going to be able to do that because we own both of the teams. You can see how that would affect the competitive integrity of the league, that you have owners doing this in that particular cynical way and altering the roster, not because they think it's the best roster or this is the right business deal, but because they have ownership stake in both, and therefore they benefit from making one team weaker and one team stronger. Something that wouldn't be incentivized otherwise in the league. Then you've got to consider, what about the 2 or 3 teams that have a similar ownership stake decide we're only going to make deals between our teams. So after the spring split, I want to sell a player. But you know what? This player, let's say Dardoch, for example, because obviously a potential superstar player, a talent, someone with a lot of potential going forwards, someone who might be a player you want for multiple years. Okay, he's not working in the lineup I have at the moment in one of my teams. You know what? Why would I sell Dardoch to a rival team and then hope that they don't crack the code and make him work and get him super effective, because then he's going to beat me and beat my team, and I've lost out on having Dardoch. I invested in him, I made the deal to get him, and you know what? One day I might want him back on my main team. What if he develops as a player off in the other team, and now I think, fuck, now he's learned some things, now he's got the right sort of players around him. I wish I'd have been able to put these players around him. I wish I could have him back in my team. Well, if we own both or 3 of the teams involved in this scenario, I can put Dardoch onto the other team and say, I'm going to give you him. Now, you've got a very good player, but I haven't quite lost him entirely, have I? Because I still kind of own or have influence over your team. So one day, if I want to, I can take Dardoch back to my team. Or you know what? At least Dardoch's not competing against me, because if your team win, I win. And if my team win, I win, because I have an ownership stake or influence over both teams. So I can also hoard talent. Now it becomes a scenario where it's unfair for the teams that I don't own. So they don't have access to the same players. There's not the same competitive integrity even in the transfer market in the LCS. So the problem here is, as I've pointed out in the title of the video and in all the different instances, Riot has displayed hypocrisy by having rules in place which in the past prohibited certain behavior, threatening punishment, and saying you must immediately divest once Riot becomes aware of your ownership conflict of interest. But in this scenario, they've gone through a whole process of hundreds of teams apparently applying to be owners of an LCS spot, ignoring quality organizations and teams with amazing track records like Immortals and Dignitas, and actually saying we're going to take on board owners who already have an ownership stake in a different team and let them have their own franchise now. But when they take on this franchise, we don't tell them, but if you get the Golden Guardians, you must immediately divest your ownership, stake, or influence or interest in this other team, Team Liquid through Axiomatic, or Cloud9 through that other guy. No, you don't have to immediately do that, and we're not going to punish you for trying to get a slot while you also have an ownership stake. In fact, you know what? Have 12 months, have 2 splits and perhaps even a world championship, have a whole season of League of Legends to have a conflict of interest. You've earned it, mate. And have this conflict of interest and potentially throw games if people can't prove it, potentially transfer players and hoard talent and be entirely non-competitive, be in a scenario which goes against the spirit of competition by putting these talents around, either to load up for Worlds or just to keep the talent and to check what's going on, and you get extra teams. You have a farm team in your main league that you can try players out, whereas other people have to try their players out in the Challenger division or elsewhere in the world and then hope that that player turns out to be good and then get him onto their main team. Very different set of scenarios of having match play in LCS contrasted against Challenger, especially because there is no the relegation motivation now. So if my team's bottom of the league, I might actually put players down onto that team and go, fuck it, they're not going to win anymore. So let's now use it as a pure farm team and see who's any good and then bring them back to my team. All sorts of problems that Riot is actively allowing with their hypocrisy. This is outrageous. Why is there one set of rules for the wealthy and the famous coming from the traditional sports world? And why is there another set of rules for all the past seasons of League of Legends for the endemic esports orgs? Why were they not allowed a cooling off period or allowed to not be punished and allowed to own multiple teams and have direct conflict of interest and compete against themselves and potentially engage in non-competitive behavior, which is against the spirit of the league and competition itself? Why was there a different set of application of the rules in the past and a totally new set of application of rules now that goes against what was even last split's rule set? So Riot has thrown the integrity of their league out of the window purely to usher in what they see as the big dogs, the saviors of esports, these big outside investment firms and traditional sports franchises that they want to be partnered with. And so they were willing to partner with these teams to ignore their own rules, their own protocol and process for how those rules were applied, where once you find out, you must immediately divest, you are possibly going to be punished. You could even be banned in the case of Renegades and Monte Cristo, or you're just directly prohibited. You may not own a team in the ULCS and the NA LCS. You may not own two NA LCS teams. So all these business opportunities that could have been in the past where people would have exploited a 12-month window and all these other elements and other certain things that could go on, egregious behavior that should not be allowed and might not be illegal in terms of the laws of the land, but in terms of Riot's laws would be illegal, or rather just would be not allowed by the rules, but you might be able to get away with if you had this cooling down period. Riot's thrown all that out and taken the competitive integrity of the league and, in fact, the application process for their permanent partnership process, the franchising concept, and seemingly just ignored it at a whim to usher in these big rich guys.
Welcome to Thorns and a Thoughts. Unfortunately, I don't have any content. The man already speaks his mind, but I ain't gonna stop you now. I assume you saw a pretty fucking good video, all right? And you're already on the man's channel, so stay a little while longer. I see you're comfortable, and just check a few more out.